Hello everybody and welcome. In this video we're going to be talking about primary and secondary income markets for debt securities, that is fixed income markets. Now this is going to be a relatively short video, largely theoretical. However, I would like to show you some real-life examples as well in this video, so we're going to go off and I'm going to, for example, go to some websites to show you examples of certain concepts. Let's start off with the primary markets aspect over here, so I'm going to write that down, primary markets. Now in the case of debt securities, what's going to happen here is that the issuer, be that a company, a government, a municipality, basically sells debt securities, which we may, very universally call bonds, although not every debt security is in fact a bond. The word bond is often reserved to denote really long-term securities. Sells debt security, maybe not security, but securities, to investors. Okay, and of course, as a result of that, raises funding, raises capital, obviously capital of a liability nature, a debt nature, which needs to be repaid. So not equity capital, but debt capital. And this may happen in two forms. It may be via what we call a public offering, in which case anybody, essentially anyone can buy, anyone can be the investor. Alternatively, this may happen via there's an or over here, a private placement. And as the name suggests, in a private placement, you're aiming the offer at what is actually a selected group of investors who have been sort of handpicked and invited to take part. So over here, this is going to be aimed or addressed to selected investors, a group of selected investors. Okay, now there isn't much more that you need to know about this. To be honest, later on in when we will be discussing in the subsequent videos the issuance of corporate debt, and then subsequently the issuance of government debt, you'll see how the offer is made in the primary market. For example, how the whole process of selling those securities, those debt securities to specific investors happens. So there's more to come, but in later lessons, as part of this section of the curriculum, you just need to know as much as is here. However, one thing that your curriculum office, the CFA Institute, does or do talk about in this this specific reading or this specific learning module is the kind of typical rationale, so the typical reasons for debut, pronunciation, got that one wrong initially, debut issuers. So why do some companies or even governments issue debt for the first time? Now, let's say that this is quite often associated with a transfer from, it's a bit like with equity, why do you initially do a public offering of shares? Why do you become a public company? Because you transition from being private to public, so something similar is going to happen here. Often transfer from private debt, which is, by the way, a concept we will be discussing quite heavily in the alternative investment section of the curriculum, because private debt is basically receiving loans, typically from funds that are specialized in granting such loans to companies, and you want to transition from private debt to the public market, and you do that by replacing your debt with bonds, which are publicly traded and which anybody can essentially, okay, initially, when they are offered in the primary market, only a selected group of investors may actually acquire these securities at first in the primary market, but after that they typically start trading publicly and more or less publicly, and they are open to be bought by anybody who wants to, anybody interested. Now, let's just say over here that in association with that transfer from private debt to public markets, just like you would, with equities, with shares, if you start offering a company's securities publicly, you need to let investors learn about that company, or I'm saying company, or about the issuer. So you're going to hold information sessions via or as part of something called a roadshow. This is organized by investment banks. Investment banks are the institutions that help companies connect with buyers of securities, be they debt securities or equity securities, shares, essentially. And banks take a company on board and they help present the company to investors, and then obviously help also drum up the interest, sort of pitch the company to investors, and therefore hope to get a lot of demand for the securities on offer. So information sessions often are going to be needed or required simply to, as I said, get the company or get the investors acquaint investors with the issuer. I'm saying company, but this could just as well apply to a non-corporate issuer like a municipality, or perhaps even a government who's reaching out to, for example, overseas investors with foreign currency denominated bonds for the first time in a specific market. I come from Poland, and there was a point in time, let's say more than a decade ago, when Poland for the first time, I believe, was issuing bonds, sovereign bonds, so treasury bonds, but denominated in the Japanese currency, Japanese yen, obviously directed and aimed at Japanese investors who hold yen holdings. And that called for a roadshow. So people from representatives of the Polish government, obviously accompanied by representatives of the relevant investment banks, flew over to Japan and got to meet investors and presented the case for buying these Polish government bonds to those investors. That was a typical roadshow kind of action. Now, aside from this, right, how we that this is associated typically with that move, we're going to list a couple of motives or rationales. Sometimes, for example, following a merger between two companies, or an acquisition by one company of another, merger, acquisition, or perhaps, a sale, a divestment, so a company sells part of itself, So following one of these, events, what you'll typically have is that a new company, obviously that's not necessarily the case, but a new company may be formed, and it will operate under a new name. And as part of that, the old debt that was held previously, or taken on previously, is going to be refinanced with a new issue. So you get fresh funds from a new issue done under a new name, as a new corporate entity, and you use that to refinance the old one. But from the point of view of the new issuer, that's a debut issue, isn't it? Now, another potential reason here, another possible reason which your book lists, is that a company finally, this is to do with corporates, a company reaches that stage in its life where its operating cash flows become quite stable, so it reduces a more mature stage of its corporate life. It starts having predictable operating cash flows, and as such, it may finally start issuing debt because, debt of a high quality that's going to be appreciated by investors who like companies with issuers with stable operating cash flows. And maybe until that reaching of that moment in its life, those cash flows were not stable enough. And another one would be this time to do with a government, a sovereign issuer borrows in a foreign currency for the first time, and that's the example I gave with, you may remember, with the Polish government doing something for the first time in the Japanese currency, and from that point of view, it was a debut issuer, not of bonds as such, but definitely yen-denominated bonds indeed. Now, let's make some additional points here. We talked about debut issuers. Now, repeat issuers or repeat issues. Somebody coming to the market and issuing bonds for the nth time, something time. Sorry, and there's going to be potentially two different ways to do this. Every time you issue a bond, you have to set up the parameters like the time to maturity, the tenor of the bond. You're also going to have to think about what kind of coupon to offer. Should I offer a fixed coupon, a floating coupon? And if it's a fixed coupon, what's going to be the coupon rate that I'm going to pay to investors, the fixed level of interest? Now, what typically happens, and this is especially common among corporate issuers, is you typically issue the bond in such a way, the new bonds, in such a way as to make sure the price which investors are willing to pay you is close to nominal value, face value, or par value. So you typically issue new bonds close to par value. So you set up the bond in such a way that investors are willing to pay you a price equal to the amount you'll have to pay them back at the end of the bond's life, because that in essence is the nominal value, par value, or face value, the amount which will have to be returned in the future. And in the meantime, you offer them a coupon. But that requires thinking very hard about the appropriate coupon. You have to set the coupon up, appropriate coupon. That requires the setting of the appropriate coupon. A coupon that will really motivate and incentivize, encourage the investors to offer a price equal to par. And as conditions change in the market, you're going to have to fluctuate with that coupon, meaning, every time you do a fresh issue, you're going to start afresh by thinking about where the coupon should be now. What will investors find? What will investors look favorably upon? However, an alternative, and this is definitely less common, less common among corporate issuers, but very common among governments, for example, is to do a reopening. In a reopening, you issue more of an existing bond. Now remember, this is in the context of coming back to the market, wanting to borrow fresh money or more money. Yeah, you reopen and you issue more of an existing bond, and keeping all the parameters, including the coupon, the same as previously. And that will cause potentially the issue to be away from par. Let me give you an example of this. Over here I've got the website of the German Federal Finance Agency. This is called the Bundesrepublik Deutschland Finanzagentur. Now, when they issue bonds, they do it via an auction process, which I'm going to discuss in subsequent videos on how sovereign issuers issue bonds. Now, over here, you'll see that on the 29th of May 2024, which is very sort of close to when I'm recording this video, the German government issued two types of 15-year bonds. Okay, 15-year, here's the tenor. The first one at the top was with a coupon of 2.6%. The second one was with a coupon of 1%. Obviously, very different. Now, in the subsequent column where you see 97.29 or 79.99, that's the price for which the bond was issued. There's actually average price, lowest accepted price, but don't worry about this for now. Anyway, the two prices, for each respective row, actually are very much the same. Now, the difference is, look, this first bond at the top, if I click on its details, if I click on its ISIN, the identification number, they will tell you this bond was issued for the first time in April 2024. It will mature in May 2041, and it pays a coupon of 2.6%, and that coupon was set up in 2024. And it aligns with what investors expect right now. So the price that was offered for this bond by investors was pretty close to par. Par in this case is 100. So if somebody pays you 97.29, that's not necessarily at par, but it's close to par value. However, the second bond offers a much lower coupon of 1%. It's also a 15-year bond, but the problem with this one was that it was first set up and issued back in April of 2022, when a coupon of 1% may have been quite acceptable. However, the German government, look, when it was a new issue back in 2022 April, offered a coupon of 1%, and investors were quite happy to pay a price, of 100 point something. So they priced the bond at par or very close to par. However, subsequently, they were doing reopenings of the same bond. And the latest reopening was done in May of 2024, when investors were only willing to pay around 80 or 79.99% of what the German government promises to repay in the future, so of the par value. And that's obviously a signal that investors are not willing to pay so much for that bond because they think the coupon with which it comes is just too low given the interest rate environment that we've got in 2024. But this is a classic reopening. The Germans are issuing more and more of the same bond quite regularly, not changing the parameters, but obviously dealing with the concept or having to live with the consequence that this is going to be issued away from par. Now, in either case, if you are a repeat issuer, the whole process of issuing these bonds is going to be very quick. So this is a very quick process, essentially, once you are already known in the market, especially if you are an investment grade issuer. So if you are an issuer with a good credit quality. For investment grade issuers, this distinction we talked about before between investment grade and non-investment grade, it will typically take something like a few hours to sell these bonds. More on that when we discuss corporate issuance. However, it's going to be a much longer process, but much longer in terms of timing for high yield or non-investment grade, high yield, or special purpose vehicle, SPV issuers. So when a special, new company is set up to issue bonds, because typically these types of issuers issue bonds that are secured. They offer secured bonds with some form of collateral built in. So this is not going to be a quick process, because when you present such bonds to investors, they're going to have to take time to investigate the quality of the collateral. So complex or more complex, let's say, analysis of the terms, the collateral involved, covenants that are built into the issue, that all of these things will have to be investigated, and that's going to take not hours but typically days. Now, another important, let's say, name that you need to appreciate, and this is common across different topics, not just fixed income, but also equity, is the underwriter or underwriters. This is the role played by banks, especially here, and they act as guarantors. So an underwriter, what they do is they guarantee, so the underwriter guarantees the sale of the offered bonds at a special price, at an offering price. And this price gets negotiated between the bank, the underwriter, and the issuer. So basically, if I decide as a bank to look after your bonds and help you sell them, I'm also going to guarantee you in a way that you will get a specific price for them. And by signing an underwriting agreement, I really have to face the consequences of what if investors don't want to buy that bond for the pre-negotiated price. Well, typically then I will have to buy any unsold bonds myself and deal with the consequences, which is not a thing you want as a bank. However, whilst underwriting is going to be quite common for good quality, high quality issues, you'll typically have no underwriting agreement signed for lower quality issuers. Banks will not necessarily want to make any guarantees concerning the success of an issue for lower quality issuers. So the only thing that banks will do, they will still take you on board as a client and represent you as an issuer, but banks will typically work on what's known as a best efforts basis, meaning I'll take your bond, I'll try to do whatever I can to sell your bonds, but I'm not guaranteeing that the offer will be successful at a specific price. And just like you saw a moment ago with the German finance agency, in the case of sovereign issues or sovereign bonds, those are typically sold via an auction process. There was a reason why over here, if I go back, you'll see that this shows the latest 10 issuance results, which are done via an auction process, hence mention here of an auction date, auction process. So the sovereign bonds are typically sold or issued via an auction, and we'll discuss that in a separate video concerning sovereign issuers. Okay, the topic of this video, this specific video, was not just primary but also secondary markets. So let's just swiftly move on to that second topic, secondary markets. You'll be relieved to hear that there is not so much I have to say over here. This is a shorter one. However, there will be more coming, respectively, for corporate bonds and sovereign bonds in subsequent videos. So secondary markets for bonds are mainly OTC, meaning over-the-counter markets, and they're going to be dominated by dealers, by dealers. So they're going to be described as quote-driven markets. You'll see what that means in just a moment, and later on as well. Quote-driven or dealer markets. Basically, a dealer, a financial institution acting as a dealer, is somebody who stands there in the market and says, look, I'm constantly ready to buy from whoever is selling, sellers of bonds. If you're somebody who wants to sell a bond, okay, sell it to me. I'll pay you what's known as a bid price. And a dealer buys over here, but they also constantly stay ready to sell. So they also sell, but when they sell for a price known as the ask price. So buyers buy the bonds, but clients, those buyers need to pay a price which is higher. So a dealer typically shows two prices, one at which they buy, one at which they sell. This is also very characteristic, for example, for foreign exchange markets, where dealers also dominate with their bid, ask, or quotes. So that's what we mean by quote-driven market. Just a note that we'll also be exploring in different topics as well. The size of the spread, and the spread is actually the difference between the ask and the bid price. So bid price. So let me draw that like this. Size of spread is a reflection of the liquidity. The more liquid a market is, the more there's happening in it, the lower typically that spread is going to be due to competitive forces. Now, let's just think about what's going to be the most liquid of all the things trading in the bond markets, in the secondary markets. Well, it's typically going to be the most recently issued sovereign securities. People trade quite heavily, trade the most recently issued sovereign bonds. So going back just a moment to that German example, if the German government has recently issued, at least recently from the point of view when I'm recording this video, a 7-year bond with a 2.4% coupon, or a 2-year bond with a 2.9% coupon, that we would expect these to be quite heavily trading in the secondary market right now. We call such securities on the run securities, so the most recently issued corporates, plus also the once again recently issued also corporate bonds. Okay, because very often the dealers and the underwriters who were handling the issue still hold some inventory of these bonds, which hasn't made its way sort of into the end investor's portfolio, who will typically hold them maybe not until maturity, but for a longer time duration. And let's also say that another reason for there to be more liquidity and increased trading, in fact, is if you observe a situation where the quality of an issuer deteriorates. That's when a lot of investors will feel compelled to sell the security from their inventory because it no longer fits their risk profile, and there obviously is going to be more increased trading if issuer quality suffers a deteriorates. What for some people is an deteriorates. What for some investors is a reason that compels them to sell, for others represents a buying opportunity. So when such changes in ratings happen, in quality happen, there's going to be typically more activity in the market for those instruments. And just a final point here, let's talk just a bit about the notion of distressed debt. Distressed debt are bonds that come from issuers that are already in or perhaps close to bankruptcy. The event that is so often is a signal that this is the beginning of the end, or in fact, well, it's not necessarily the end, but you can lift yourself out of bankruptcy, but things are looking bad. As I just mentioned a moment ago, some investors are going to simply have to get rid of these bonds because, for example, if you're a fund, you typically, as part of your investment policy, will make a pledge that you shall not invest in bonds beyond a certain quality, and definitely not hold bonds of companies who have gone into bankruptcy. So there may be quite a lot of forced sales by some investors who have to sort of dissociate themselves from those kinds of bonds. But as I mentioned before, what is a reason for some to sell represents a buying opportunity. So buying opportunity for others. For those who are able or actually want to take that bit more risk, those bonds will obviously trade at low prices. And as I mentioned, a bankruptcy doesn't necessarily mean it's the end. A company will enter a formal process out of which it may come out with with the ability to maybe not repay the bonds fully, but to the bonds may get restructured and investors may get something out of them still. And there are, hedge funds who buy such distressed securities, as well as special distressed debt funds that focus on finding such companies or issuers in trouble. Debt funds I wanted to write over here. Now, even though a company may be in financial distress, trading in these bonds often continues. Trading continues in the secondary market until the company in question goes formally into liquidation. That means, it ceases activity and its assets get sold in order to pay off its debts, including the amounts owing to bondholders, until that process kicks in. Trading continues, or until the debt is formally restructured, and for example, the maturity date gets extended, or the coupon gets changed, or maybe the face value, the par value, the nominal value gets written down a bit. We will no longer promise to pay you back 100, but less. Obviously, those restructurings do not happen just because the company says, well, this is what I'm going to do. It has to be negotiated with the major holders of the debts so as to get their consent. But sometimes, you may think to yourself, well, if they had previously promised to pay me back 100 and now they're saying they'll only be able to pay me back at 80 or 60 or 70, should I actually consent to this restructuring? Well, sometimes the answer is yes, because it's better to get 60 or 70 if the company manages to lift itself, rather than face the challenge of getting anything out if the company goes into immediate liquidation. So you have to choose the better alternative. None of them may be essentially good, but one of them will be a better one. And one more thing, this idea of trading continuing until the company goes into liquidation, please note that this is different. So this feature is unlike what you see with shares, equity instruments, because with shares get typically delisted, so taken off an exchange, so delisted from an exchange much earlier than bonds cease trading. So bonds of companies in distress typically keep trading quite for a longer period than the shares of the same companies. And one more thing, because especially corporates can issue many bonds, multiple bonds at different points in time with different parameters, with different maturity dates, with different coupons, etc. Every such issue represents a specific security, right, with its own individual identification number and so on. And many of those issues, because everything is so fragmented here, many of these issues do not trade in a regular way. So they do not trade regularly. And sometimes, in order to get an idea, well, how much are the bonds actually worth, the bonds that I'm holding in my portfolio, how do I value my portfolio? The prices may need to be derived, because you can't take them from the market if there are no ongoing transactions, from more liquid bonds for which you have price information. By doing, that a bond with these features are trading for this much, then there are trades. Another bond is trading, but once again with slightly different parameters, is trading for this much, and you have to do some kind of interpolation. Find a price from find a price for your bonds, the ones that you hold, by interpolating from other prices. And actually, in subsequent sections of the fixed income curriculum, we'll be doing numerical exercises on this under a heading called matrix prices. This is where you use the price information about other bonds to price a bond with different features, but you know at least certain limits to where the price should be.